Welcome to Global Economic Brief, where we analyze the hidden mechanisms shaping our world's financial and geopolitical future starting today. Imagine a world in early 2026 where the longest undefended border in history suddenly becomes a wall of economic silence. The political rhetoric in Washington has shifted drastically, declaring that America no longer needs its northern neighbor to survive or thrive. This bold claim asserts that the United States is fully self-sufficient and that the Canadian partnership is merely a burden. On the surface, the numbers seem to support this arrogance, as the American economy dwarfs Canada's by more than 10 times. However, beneath the surface statistics lies a complex web of dependency that, if broken, would cause catastrophic failure for America. The first and most immediate shock would hit the energy sector, shattering the illusion of American energy independence within mere weeks. The United States currently imports over 60% of its total crude oil directly from Canada, a massive dependency most ignore. It is not just about the quantity of oil, but the specific type of heavy crude that American refineries desperately need. US refineries in the Gulf Coast were engineered decades ago specifically to process heavy, sour crude oil, not light domestic shale. While America produces plenty of light shale oil, its own refineries cannot efficiently process it into diesel and jet fuel. Without Canadian heavy crude, these multi-billion-dollar facilities would run at half capacity, causing an immediate shortage of refined fuels. Gas prices across the United States would likely double overnight, triggering inflation that would ripple through every sector of the economy. The aviation industry would face a critical crisis as the production of jet fuel plummets without the heavy crude feedstock required. Replacing Canadian oil would require thousands of supertankers from the Middle East, taking weeks to arrive and costing significantly more. The logistical nightmare of replacing pipeline delivery with seaborne cargo would add a massive premium to every single barrel of oil. Beyond oil, the U.S. Northeast relies heavily on Canadian hydropower and natural gas to keep lights on and homes warm in winter. Cutting off these energy ties would plunge millions of Americans into darkness and freezing temperatures during the harsh winter months. The second major casualty of this diplomatic rupture would be the North American automotive industry, which is deeply and irrevocably integrated. A single automotive part often crosses the US-Canada border up to 6 times before it is finally installed in a car. Disrupting this flow would not just slow down production, it would completely halt assembly lines in Detroit, Ohio, and Ontario instantly. Major American automakers would face billions in losses within the first month, forcing mass layoffs and factory closures across the Midwest. The stock market would react violently, wiping out shareholder value as the realization of a broken supply chain sets in. Ports would become choke points, unable to handle the sudden shift in logistics, further exacerbating the supply chain crisis nationwide. But the most strategic loss for the United States would be in the race for the future: critical minerals and technology. Canada sits on some of the world's largest reserves of the essential minerals needed to build batteries, microchips, and defense systems. Without Canada, the U.S. has almost no viable alternative to China for processing the materials required for the green energy transition. The ambitious plans for American gigafactories would crumble without the steady supply of ethically sourced Canadian lithium and nickel. National defense would also be compromised, as U.S. military technology relies heavily on specialized metals imported from its northern ally. Canada is the world's second largest producer of uranium, a critical fuel source for America's fleet of nuclear power plants. Losing access to this uranium would threaten the stability of the U.S. power grid, which relies on nuclear for base load energy. Agriculture is another sector where the interdependence is deep, involving the food on American tables and the fertilizer for crops. Canada is the world's largest producer of potash, a vital fertilizer ingredient that American farmers cannot grow crops without. A shortage of potash would lead to lower crop yields in the U.S., driving up food prices and threatening global food security. Consumers would see the impact immediately at the grocery store, with prices for bread, vegetables, and meat climbing rapidly. Water resources are also shared, And diplomatic tension could complicate the management of the Great Lakes and other vital waterways. The Great Lakes hold 20% of the world's fresh surface water, a resource that will become more valuable than oil. Faced with American hostility, Canada would not simply collapse, it would pivot rapidly to find new partners on the global stage. China would likely welcome the opportunity to replace the US as Canada's primary trading partner, gaining a foothold in North America. New trade agreements would be signed with the European Union, India, and Asian nations, diversifying Canada's economy away from the US. Geopolitically, this would be a disaster for Washington, potentially opening the Canadian Arctic to Chinese or Russian influence and investment. The NORAD Defense Pact, which protects North American airspace, would be severely strained, leaving a gaping hole in continental security. Control over the Northwest Passage would become a major flashpoint, with Canada potentially charging the US for access to the route. American diplomats would soon realize that by pushing Canada away, they have created a security threat on their own northern border. Anti-American sentiment in Canada would reach historic highs, unifying the country against what they perceive as a bullying neighbor. The US tech sector relies heavily on Canadian talent, and a rift would stop the brain drain that fuels American innovation. Thousands of skilled engineers, doctors, and scientists might return to Canada, strengthening its economy while leaving gaps in the American workforce. The American healthcare system, which employs many Canadian professionals, would face critical staffing shortages in border states and beyond. The housing market in the US would also suffer, as Canada is the primary supplier of softwood lumber for home construction. Without Canadian lumber, the cost of building a new home in the US would skyrocket, deepening the existing housing affordability crisis. The cumulative effect of these shortages would be a sustained period of stagflation, with high prices and stagnant economic growth. Surprisingly, the Canadian dollar might eventually stabilize and strengthen as the country secures new, diverse international markets for its resources. Border cities that rely on daily cross-border commerce would become ghost towns, their local economies decimated by the new political reality. The human cost would be immense, separating families and communities that have been interwoven for generations across the border. Realizing the mistake, Washington might try to reverse course, but the trust that took a century to build would be gone. Canada would have already moved on, integrating itself more deeply into the global economy rather than relying solely on America. The narrative that Canada needs America more than America needs Canada would be proven fundamentally and painfully wrong. The U.S. energy sector would eventually adapt, but at a tremendous cost of time, money, and environmental standards. The crisis might accelerate the U.S. transition to renewables, but the transition period would be chaotic and economically painful. American lifestyle habits would be forced to change, with high energy costs curbing the culture of consumption and travel. Political instability in the U.S. would rise as voters punish the administration for the economic hardship caused by the rift. Canada could emerge as a neutral broker in international affairs, distinct from U.S. interests and more aligned with global consensus. The rupture could even accelerate the move away from the U.S. dollar as the world's reserve currency in trade. Ironically, U.S. companies might move headquarters to Canada to access global markets and resources without the burden of tariffs. At the United Nations, the once unified North American voting bloc would fracture, weakening Western influence on global policy. The Arctic would become a zone of high tension, requiring increased military spending to patrol a border that was once safe. Scientific collaboration on climate change and environmental protection would cease, hindering efforts to combat global warming in the north. Canada's role as a global environmental steward would be reinforced, attracting green investment that might have gone to the U.S. Desperate to rebuild supply chains, the U.S. might relax environmental regulations, leading to increased pollution and public health issues. The quality of life for average Americans would decline, not just economically, but environmentally as the country turns inward. Tourism would take a hit, with millions of annual trips between the two countries cancelled due to visa restrictions and hostility. Cultural exchanges, sports leagues, And shared entertainment industries would face logistical nightmares and a loss of shared identity. The entertainment industry would lose its Hollywood North production hub, driving up the cost of making movies and TV shows. Academic institutions would lose valuable research partnerships and the cross-pollination of ideas that drives innovation and progress. The border would become a militarized zone, consuming billions in tax dollars to secure a line that was once open. Surveillance technology would replace friendly waves, as paranoia dictates the new relationship between the two former allies. Fishing rights disputes in the Atlantic and Pacific would flare up, potentially leading to skirmishes between Coast Guard vessels. Regional economies like New England's fishing industry would suffer greatly without access to Canadian processing and markets. Digital infrastructure and data sharing agreements would be reviewed, threatening the free flow of information across the continent. Small businesses that thrive on cross-border traffic would be the first to fail, destroying the livelihoods of thousands. Emergency mutual aid agreements for fires, floods, and storms would be cancelled, leaving border communities vulnerable to disasters. Wildfires ignoring national boundaries would burn longer and more destructively without the coordinated response of both nations' fire services. The environmental setback would be global, as a divided North America fails to lead on climate action initiatives. We might even see a reversal of migration patterns, with Americans seeking economic stability and healthcare in Canada. Canada would likely tighten its own borders, selective about who enters, further isolating the American population. International investors would view the US as unstable and unreliable, shifting capital to more predictable markets in Asia and Europe. Wall Street would punish the isolationist policy, as global corporations cannot function efficiently in a fragmented North American market. Canadian tech hubs like Waterloo and Montreal would thrive, developing their own IP rather than selling it to Silicon Valley. Innovation in AI and robotics would continue in Canada, supported by government grants and open immigration policies for talent. The U.S. attempt at total autarky would result in lower quality goods and higher prices for the American consumer. The standard of living for the middle and lower classes in America would erode significantly due to the cost of living crisis. Government budgets would be reallocated from social services to subsidies and security, further straining the social fabric. Homelessness and poverty rates would likely increase as the economic shockwaves displace workers from affected industries. Canada would position itself as a clean energy superpower, exporting hydrogen and LNG to a Europe hungry for non-Russian energy. The European Union would fast-track deeper integration with Canada, seeing it as a reliable bastion of Western values. The United States would find itself increasingly isolated in the G7, with Canada aligning more closely with European allies. Adversaries like China would exploit this division, using propaganda to highlight the failure of the American alliance system. Seeing how the U.S. treats its closest neighbor, nations in South America might also pivot away from Washington's influence. The decades-long project of North American integration would be undone, replaced by suspicion and competitive barriers. The historical bond forged in blood during 2 world wars would be dishonored, forgotten for short-term political posturing. Veterans organizations on both sides would voice their dismay, seeing the alliance they defended torn apart by politicians. Cooperation in space exploration would suffer, with the Canadian Space Agency potentially withdrawing its vital robotics technology. The International Space Station operations could be jeopardized, complicating future missions to the Moon and Mars. Canada would likely shift its space budget to partner with the European Space Agency, leaving NASA to shoulder costs alone. This divergence would extend humanity's reach into the stars, but as separate factions rather than a united planet. Back on Earth, simple necessities like paper and packaging would become scarce, as Canada dominates the forestry products market. The publishing industry would face a crisis, with the cost of books, newspapers, and cardboard shipping boxes rising sharply. E-commerce giants would struggle to ship products efficiently, slowing down the retail economy that relies on delivery. Even road safety would be compromised, as many U.S. states rely on Canadian rock salt to de-ice roads in winter. A shortage of road salt would lead to more accidents, traffic delays, and economic paralysis during snowstorms. Aluminum is another critical import. Without Canadian smelting, U.S. beverage and aerospace industries would face immediate supply gaps. Consumers would pay more for everything from a can of soda to a new car, fueling the inflationary spiral. Restarting dormant U.S. aluminum smelters requires massive amounts of electricity, which is now expensive and scarce. This creates a vicious cycle. You need energy to produce materials, but you lack the energy because of the rift. Meanwhile, Canadian aluminum would flow to Asian markets, helping competitors build the very products America can no longer afford.
Commercial real estate in major U.S. cities would crash as businesses downsize or go bankrupt due to operational costs. Pension funds invested in North American integrated industries would suffer heavy losses, threatening the retirement security of millions. The Federal Reserve might be forced to print money to bail out failing industries, leading to hyperinflation risks. Middle-class wealth, largely tied to home values and retirement accounts, would evaporate, increasing the wealth gap. Economic desperation often leads to increased crime rates, adding another layer of misery to the domestic situation. Conversely, Canada's strong social safety net might help it weather the storm with greater social stability and cohesion. The American perception of Canada would shift from dismissal to envy, realizing they destroyed a good thing. States like New York and Michigan might attempt to bypass Washington, negotiating their own side deals with Canadian provinces. This could trigger a constitutional crisis in the U.S., as states fight for their economic survival against federal policy. In extreme scenarios, we might see the rise of secessionist movements in regions that feel more aligned with Canada. For Canada, the crisis would be a defining moment of nation building, finally stepping out of America's shadow completely. A renaissance of Canadian culture would likely emerge, celebrating a distinct identity that is resilient and independent. Strategically, the U.S. loses its northern buffer zone, making the homeland feel smaller and more vulnerable than ever. The entire architecture of continental missile defense would need to be redesigned at a cost of trillions of dollars. Russia would undoubtedly seize the opportunity to expand its claims in the Arctic. Unchallenged by a united front, the U.S. Navy would be forced to divert fleets from the Pacific and Atlantic to patrol the Arctic Ocean constantly. This dispersion of military power would weaken America's ability to project force in key regions like the South China Sea. Asian allies like Japan and South Korea would question America's judgment and reliability, potentially seeking their own nuclear deterrence. The post-World War II international order, built on American alliances, would effectively collapse from the inside out. We would enter a truly multipolar world, chaotic and unpredictable, where the U.S. is just one of many great powers. Global corporations would diversify their supply chains away from the U.S. to avoid political risk, harming the American economy. Foreign direct investment into the United States would plummet, as the country is no longer seen as a safe harbor. Canada, with its stability and resources, could become the new safe haven for global capital in North America. We might even see a flight of capital from wealthy Americans moving their assets to Canadian banks for security. Canada's banking system, already one of the most stable in the world, would solidify its reputation as a global leader. The U.S. national debt would become harder to service as interest rates rise and the economy contracts. Credit rating agencies might downgrade U.S. sovereign debt, triggering a financial crisis of unprecedented magnitude. Joint medical research on cancer and other diseases would stall, delaying breakthroughs that could save millions of lives. In the event of a new pandemic, the lack of data sharing and coordinated response would lead to higher mortality rates. Wildlife migration patterns would be disrupted by physical barriers, threatening the biodiversity of the shared ecosystem. International peace parks, symbols of friendship and nature, would be divided, losing their meaning and ecological integrity. The ski industry, which relies on tourists crossing the border in both directions, would face bankruptcy and closures. Professional sports leagues like the NHL and NBA would have to restructure entirely, losing revenue and fan engagement. Canadian teams might be forced to withdraw or relocate, ending over a century of sporting tradition and rivalry. For millions of fans, the joy of shared competition would be replaced by the bitterness of political division. The North American Rail Network, which operates as a single organism, would face logistical chaos and massive delays. Perishable goods would spoil in transit, leading to waste and further driving up the cost of food. U.S. airlines might be banned from Canadian airspace, forcing costly detours for flights to Europe and Asia. This would make air travel significantly more expensive and time-consuming for American passengers and cargo alike. The state of Alaska would be effectively cut off by land, relying entirely on sea and air for supplies. The cost of living in Alaska would become unbearable, potentially triggering a mass exodus of its population. Supplying military bases in Alaska would become a logistical nightmare, weakening the U.S. strategic position in the Pacific. The political climate would darken, with demagogues using the crisis to fuel anger and xenophobia. Education might suffer as historical facts about the friendship are distorted to fit the new antagonistic narrative. A generation of young people would grow up viewing their neighbors as enemies rather than friends and cousins. The concept of a free and open internet in North America could end, replaced by digital firewalls and censorship. Tech companies would have to maintain separate versions of their products for each country, reducing efficiency and innovation. Data privacy would be compromised as governments invoke national security to monitor cross-border communications. Cyber warfare between the two nations, or by third parties exploiting the chaos, could target critical infrastructure. The integrated power grid, now decoupled, would be less resilient and more vulnerable to cascading failures and attacks. Long-term food security would remain an issue, with less variety and higher costs becoming the new normal. The nutritional quality of the American diet might decline as fresh produce from Canadian greenhouses becomes unavailable. Many restaurants would be forced to close or drastically change their menus, unable to afford imported ingredients. The craft beer and wine industries, which rely on cross-border trade of hops and grapes, would shrink. Culinary diversity would suffer, making the cultural landscape of North America poorer and less vibrant. Northern U.S. cities would face a slow decline, losing their status as gateways to the Canadian market. We might see an internal migration within the U.S., with people fleeing the economically depressed northern border states. This would exacerbate regional economic imbalances, creating further political polarization between different parts of the country. Instead of a partner, Canada would become a direct competitor, undercutting U.S. businesses in global markets.
Canada would double down on attracting global talent, pitching itself as the open, stable alternative to America. The United States would lose its edge in the global war for talent, hindering its long-term innovation potential. American soft power, its cultural and moral influence, would be severely diminished in the eyes of the world. The narrative of America as a benevolent leader would be replaced by the image of a self-destructive bully. Trust in international treaties would collapse, as no country would believe American commitments are permanent. We would enter an era of global instability, where the rules-based order is replaced by might makes right. This split would be like Brexit, but on a much larger, more integrated, and more destructive scale. There would be no winners in this divorce, only two losers, with one suffering significantly more self-inflicted wounds. History suggests that the smaller, more adaptable nation, Canada, would likely pivot and recover faster than the giant. The United States might take decades to repair the economic and diplomatic damage caused by such a decision. This scenario serves as a stark warning to policymakers who believe that isolationism is a path to prosperity. Interdependence is not a weakness to be eliminated, but a strategic strength that makes both nations more powerful. The only viable path forward is deeper cooperation, respecting the sovereignty and value of the Canadian partnership. The future of North America depends on recognizing that we are stronger together than we could ever be apart. Imagine instead a future where we combine our resources to lead the world in green energy and technology. A fully integrated battery supply chain could end dependence on China and re-industrialize the entire Rust Belt. Jointly protecting the Arctic ensures that North American sovereignty remains intact against rising global threats. A united North American economy remains the most formidable force on the planet, capable of outcompeting anyone. Cooperation guarantees a higher quality of life, cleaner environment, and greater security for citizens on both sides. We must not let temporary political rhetoric dismantle a century of hard-won friendship and economic integration. It is time to look at the hard facts of our economic reality, rather than the empty slogans of populism. Canada is not a dependency to be shed, but the most reliable and valuable ally the United States has. And for Canada, the United States remains an indispensable partner, despite the challenges of living next to a giant. This delicate balance requires constant care, respect, and communication to maintain, not reckless threats and tariffs. The conclusion is simple and undeniable. America needs Canada just as much as Canada needs America. To think otherwise is a dangerous delusion that would cost us our prosperity, our security, and our future. If you found this analysis insightful, please share this video to spread awareness about this critical issue. Thank you for watching Global Economic Brief. Subscribe for more deep dives into the economy. See you in the next video.